I want to start with a picture, not a theory. A port in Oman is burning. Alerts are flashing across the Gulf. American officials keep talking about how many Iranian launchers have supposedly been destroyed. Israeli briefings keep repeating the same message, that Iran is running out. Iran is weakening. Iran is losing the ability to strike in a meaningful way. And then, in the middle of all that confident language, Iran launches another heavy missile with a warhead big enough to devastate whatever it hits. That is the first thing I want you to hold in your mind. Because the most frightening possibility in this war is not that Iran is collapsing. It is that Iran is pacing itself. The real story is not that Iran has fired less. It is that Iran may be firing less because it no longer needs to fire more. A lot of people are reading the sharp drop in missile launches as proof that the Iranian arsenal has been broken. I think that reading is dangerously shallow. Yes, Iran has undoubtedly lost launchers. Yes, the bombing has done real damage. Hospitals have been destroyed. Schools have been destroyed. Large parts of Tehran have been brutalized. Nobody looking honestly at this war can deny that. But there is a difference between damage and disarmament, and that difference is the whole story. If a military is reduced to random, inaccurate, desperate fire, then fewer launches may mean exhaustion. But if a military is still able to launch highly accurate, high-impact weapons that devastate whatever they hit, then fewer launches may mean something very different. It may mean selection. It may mean calibration. It may mean the side everyone says is weakening is actually measuring the battlefield much more carefully than the side that claims to be winning. That is what makes this moment so dangerous. Iran may not be spraying missiles because it has learned it does not need to. At the beginning of the war, large volleys served one purpose. They forced anti-missile systems in Israel, in the Gulf, and at sea to expend interceptors at a very high rate. They stressed radar networks. They made every defending state burn through inventory. Once that phase was complete, the logic changes. You do not keep spending expensive weapons the same way if the target set has changed and if the defender is already thinner than it wants to admit. What matters now is not volume. What matters now is effect. And by that standard, the picture looks very different from the triumphant public messaging coming out of Washington. The engineers and military professionals who watch impact footage do not speak like politicians. They are not impressed by press conference language. They look at crater size. They look at warhead weight. They look at structural collapse. They look at whether a weapon actually arrived where it was sent. On that question, the evidence is deeply uncomfortable for anyone still trying to sell the fantasy that Iranian precision is poor. The missiles that are getting through are not random. The hits are not symbolic. They are chosen. And they are damaging. So now we come to the question that really matters. If Iran still has precision, if Iran still has hidden inventory, if Iran is still conducting battle damage assessment with drones and satellite imagery, if it is striking with selection rather than panic, then what is it waiting for? I think the answer is simple and terrifying. Iran is holding back because it is preserving escalation options for the moment. It believes the war truly enters its decisive phase. That is why every conversation about Kharg Island matters so much. That is why every threat against the remaining oil infrastructure matters so much. If the United States or Israel crosses from punishment into attempted economic strangulation at the level of Iran's core export system, then the Iranian response will not be another ordinary round of exchange. It will be a different war. And everyone in the region knows this. If Kharg is hit hard enough, if Tehran concludes that the objective is not military pressure, but the permanent destruction of its ability to function as a state, then the target list widens instantly. Gulf oil infrastructure becomes a battlefield. Ports become a battlefield. Desalination plants become a battlefield. Shipping routes become a battlefield. The Strait of Hormuz does not merely stay tense. It becomes structurally uninsurable. That is not a normal escalation. That is a system event. People still talk about Hormuz as though it is only an oil story. It is not only an oil story. It is oil, yes. But it is also insurance, freight, electricity costs, industrial inputs, fertilizer chains, currency pressure, shipping confidence, sovereign risk, and political stability across countries that were never supposed to be direct participants in this war. Once the Gulf becomes a zone where every tanker, every refinery, every desalination node can be targeted on purpose, the shock stops being regional, it becomes global, and this is where the most important American illusion begins to crack. There are people in Washington who still talk as if there's some clean next step available: send in more force, tighten pressure, show resolve, make the other side bend, but that logic only works if you still possess a believable ladder upward. And I do not think the United States still has one. Take the most reckless option first: boots on the ground. This is the sort of thing people say casually on television because they have never looked at the map, honestly. Iran is not a raid. Iran is not a quick punitive excursion. Iran is not a weekend operation. It is vast territory, brutal terrain, mountain corridors, huge distances, and a defender that has spent decades studying exactly how the United States fights after the first breakthrough. And more importantly, warfare has changed. 30 years ago, a large army could build up slowly, unload equipment, move in ponderous columns, and trust that mass itself would create momentum. That world is disappearing today. Any serious force concentration is visible. Persistent surveillance from space, from drones, from electronic collection, from commercial imagery, from every layer of the modern sensor environment means a buildup does not hide. A buildup advertises itself. That changes everything. It means you do not get the old luxury of assembling a massive invasion force close to the battlefield and then pretending surprise still exists. Ships unloading equipment, aircraft cycling personnel, ports filling with armor, staging grounds expanding, convoys moving inland, all of it becomes targetable before the operation truly begins. If the other side still retains missiles and drones with precision, then your invasion force can start bleeding before it is even properly out of the gate. So when people talk about a ground invasion of Iran, they are talking about something the United States is not politically ready for, logistically ready for, or structurally suited for. The army is smaller than it used to be. The Marine Corps is lighter than it used to be. The public has no appetite for a giant land war in this geography. And even if the political class wanted it, the battlefield is no longer kind to large exposed buildup models. That means the most extreme option is not just unattractive. It is borderline absurd. Now, take the second option: endless air and naval pressure without ground commitment. This sounds more realistic. It is also the trap, because air and naval power can punish. They can destroy facilities, they can kill commanders, they can devastate cities. We have seen all of that already, but punishment and durable strategic outcome are not the same thing. If the other side's political will hardens, if its dispersed infrastructure remains partly functional, if its hidden reserves still matter, and if your own coalition begins to fracture under the economic cost, then air power becomes a machine for making the environment worse without delivering the ending you promised. That is the pattern I see emerging. Now the objectives were too large, the assumptions were too shallow, the public language outran the real strategic position. Regime change by decapitation is not a strategy. It is wishful thinking with explosives. Killing people you dislike at the top of a state does not automatically produce a new state more favorable to you. Often it produces the opposite. A wounded system hardens. Internal change that might have happened on its own gets delayed. National anger becomes broader. And no matter who comes next, they do not forget who bombed them. That is where the argument in this war becomes much bigger than Iran, because what Iran is really signaling now is not just military endurance. It is end state ambition. The message coming from Tehran and from Iranian-aligned voices is becoming clearer by the week. They are not interested in going back to the old status quo. They are not interested in living indefinitely with Israeli strike capacity. American basing networks in the Gulf and neighboring states that quietly assist operations against them while claiming neutrality in public. From their point of view, that old arrangement has already failed. It led directly to this war. So if the war ends at all, they want it to end differently. That is a profound problem for Washington, because the likely Iranian demand at the end of this road is not small. It is not cosmetic. It is not a speech. It is something closer to this American power out of the Gulf in the form that made this war possible. And suddenly, the whole conflict looks different. Can America bomb Iran hard enough to prove strength? The question becomes, can America achieve its goals without accepting an outcome that looks, in practical terms, like strategic rollback? I think that is the fork. One path is escalation into a larger disaster, more strikes, more shattered infrastructure, more pressure on Kharg, more pressure on Gulf assets, more regional fear, more economic damage, and still no clean political outcome. The second path is an off-ramp disguised as victory language. Publicly, Washington would say the nuclear threat was damaged, military capabilities were degraded, deterrence was restored. Privately, the war would end in an arrangement. Nobody in the triumphalist camp would truly want a settlement that acknowledges Iran cannot be erased, that the old Gulf order cannot simply be reset, and that some broader structure for Hormuz and regional security will eventually have to include not just the United States, but China, Russia, India, Japan, Korea, and every state that depends on the waterway remaining open. In other words, the farther this war goes, the more likely the ending becomes something much closer to a negotiated international constraint than an American dictated solution. And that brings us to the nuclear question, which hangs over everything like a future verdict. There's a brutal lesson embedded in this war, and everyone can see it. If you do not possess a nuclear deterrent, and if Washington decides your government is intolerable, then your country remains vulnerable to extreme military punishment. You can argue whether that lesson is moral, rational, or dangerous. It does not matter. The strategic lesson is what it is. Every capital in the world is watching. Every military planner is watching. Every leadership circle capable of thinking 10 years ahead is watching. The people who hate nuclear weapons should understand this most clearly, because this kind of war is exactly what teaches states to want them. I do not know whether Iran will decide to cross that threshold in the future. The side claiming it is restoring order may in fact be manufacturing the incentives for a much more dangerous order. That is why I come back to the opening image. A burning port in Oman, fewer Iranian launches, more confident American briefings, and then another devastating precision strike that reminds everyone the war reserve may be far from exhausted. The terrifying possibility is not that Iran is lashing out blindly. It is that Iran is still choosing what to hit, choosing what to preserve, choosing what not to reveal yet, choosing how much damage is enough to shape the ending of the war and deter the next one. And if that is true, then the real danger is not the missiles that have already flown. The real danger is the inventory still being saved. For the moment, Washington finally realizes it has run out of good options. War without strategy always becomes war without end, and a patient enemy with reserves is more dangerous than a wounded enemy with rage. That is the point people still do not want to face. The frightening thing is not that Iran is collapsing slowly. The frightening thing is that Iran may be holding back because it believes time is now working for it,